Hi Ben, it's me. I'm just making this video with my notes on sufficient and necessary terms, and I'm gonna just go through it, and then I suggest you screenshot some things. I'll tell you what you should screenshot. So you already know that every conditional statement has two parts: the sufficient term and the necessary term. So obviously the sufficient term follows if. So if X, then Y. So sufficient is the X, and necessary is the second part. Sufficient means enough. So this is super general stuff, but this helped me understand it better, in terms of just thinking about it theoretically. And then on the following pages, I get more into specific words that are really helpful in understanding. So sufficient means that it's enough. You don't need any additional information to know the other part is true. The sufficient term is also called the trigger term. That really helped me. Just blank triggers something. So the necessary term follows the then. Necessary equals required means required. When the sufficient term is present, this part is required. This term is the result of the trigger, the consequence of the trigger. The necessary term itself does not trigger anything. So those things just help me think about it. These are just super easy examples. You already know how to do this stuff. Yeah, I guess I'll go through it and then just skip over it if this is too basic. I get into more good things. Drivers must pay a toll to cross the bridge. So paying a toll is the necessary term because it does not trigger anything. And crossing the bridge is the sufficient term to know that you must pay the toll. So crossing the bridge, then toll. If bridge, then pay a toll. The state of California requires that all passengers wear a seatbelt when riding in a moving vehicle. So being in California is sufficient to know that a passenger will be wearing a seatbelt, which is the necessary term. So if California, then seatbelt. And I guess you can screenshot this if you want right here. Right there. I don't know. It's probably unclear for the bottom. Okay. Any student in the hall after the bell rings will get a detention slip. Being in the hall after the bell is sufficient to know that she or he will be given a slip, which is the necessary term. If you're in the hall, then slip. The LSAT is a prerequisite to getting into law school. No shit. Getting into law school is sufficient to know that the necessary term, the consequence term, is the LSAT. Law school, then LSAT. If law school, that means you took the LSAT. You can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. Omelet is sufficient to know that the necessary term is you broke a few eggs. If omelet, then break eggs. Cheaters never prosper. Cheater is sufficient enough to know you will never prosper, which is the necessary term. If cheater, no prospering. Sarah cannot go to the movies unless she cleans her room. Go to the movies is sufficient enough to know the necessary term is clean room. If movies, then clean room. Okay, you already know how to do all that. It's so easy, right? A note about cause and effect. If-then statements with may or maybe in them are not very useful and not very common on the LSAT. Don't automatically conflate cause and effect relationships with sufficient necessary. Okay, that's okay. Conditional with and or. So and means you need both, you already know this probably, terms for the conditional to be relevant, fulfilled, or means you need at least one term for the conditional to be relevant or fulfilled. So neither X nor or means not X and not Y. So the way I write and I don't know if you know this already, but the way I write, so if X, then Y and Z. So when you do the contrapositive, it's every and turns into an or, and every or turns into an and. So it's if not Y or not Z, then not X. So you flip it, and becomes or, and then if it was the other way, if it was if X then Y or Z, then it would be if not Y and not Z, then not X. Okay, if then format, this is the trigger, this is the result, the necessary term. When you just know the necessary term, you don't know about the trigger sufficient term. Words that denote that one thing is sufficient for another to happen. So if you see any of these words, then you know, like if you see any of these words by like a condition and you're confused on knowing if it's a sufficient term or the necessary, if this word is by a condition, you know that this is the sufficient term. So the words include all, any, which any includes any time, any place, anybody, etc. So anything, and then every time, everybody, etc. Whenever, each. So I just tried to memorize this and wrote it out a bunch of times. I would screenshot this and write those down. It's really helpful when you're like going through example problems. That's what I did. And I still go back. I still reference this all the time. Okay, so I hope you got that. And then these are if-then formats with negatives. Be careful about the way sentences are worded. A good practice is to always ask yourself who or what is the sentence about. Okay, so the negative words that indicate a sufficient, necessary relationship include none, never, not, no one. None, never, not, no one. None, never, not, and no one. Look, this is like my workout routine. Wow. From a while ago. Okay, so did you get that screenshot? None, never, not, and no one. None, never, not, and no one. Okay. Only if, and the only. Only typically signals the necessary term. Only if is the same as only. So only if also signifies the necessary term, which is the term right after then. So the arrow symbolizes then, right? I think you already know this, but I'm just going to say it anyways. So if X, then Y. So if is the sufficient, this is the necessary part. Well, this is the necessary, and this is the sufficient. But this if triggers the necessary or the sufficient. If triggers the sufficient, then triggers the necessary. Just like these words trigger the sufficient, and only and only if triggers the necessary. So then blank. The only signals the sufficient term in a conditional relationship. Oh, so if it says the only, then it's the sufficient term. It's the first part of it. But if it's only or only if, it's the necessary, the second part of it. Yeah, I would definitely, I still have to memorize, like I'm still trying to memorize. So only and only if is the necessary. the only is the sufficient. So the word only in formal logic, I would screenshot this. Only signals the necessary, only if signals the necessary, the only signals the sufficient. All right, unless and without. Unless signals a requirement, the necessary term. So unless is the same as then. So when you see then or unless in like the prompt, you know that that's the necessary term. How to make a formal logic statement with unless. Negate. Okay, so you have to negate the sufficient statement and substitute then for the word unless. So here's an example. No x unless y translates to if x then y. So what they did was they negated the sufficient term, which is no x, and substituted unless for then. So negating no x means yes x, if x, then y. So in the second example, A unless B. So you negate the first term and change this to then. So if not A, then B. Without functions the same exact way as unless. So if you see A without B, you do if not A, then B. If you see no x without y, it's the same. If, negate this so it's positive, if y, then x, or if x, then y. Okay, you get it. I would practice that. Or like memorize that. If and but only if. The phrase if but only if and only if indicate a biconditional relationship. Each term in the relationship is both sufficient and necessary for the other term. X if and only if y can be written as if x then y, if y then x, or x arrow y. So you know that you have to, if you have an x, you have a y. If you have a y, you have an x. You have to have them together or you can't have them at all. So you either have them both or you don't have either of them at all. Yeah. Okay. I don't know if you're like already know this and this is like, Jamie, you're explaining the simple, stupid stuff. So I hope this is helpful. And if not, it's just helpful for me to say it out loud. Okay, only and only if are necessary, the only is sufficient. So I'm just rewriting that. Making valid deductions from conditional statements. If X, then B. If A, then C. Okay, so you know that that's just, when you see that, if A, then both B and C. And then to negate it, to contrapositive it, it would be if not B, and this is an and, or, so you switch it from and or, not C, then not A. Same term in the necessary. If T, then V. If W, then V. So when you have the same term in the necessary portion, this portion, if you have two V's, the deduction would be if either T or W, then both. Or, then both, then V. So you just take, I mean, that's probably simple for you to get. So when these are the same, you could just combine these. But this is an or. So just note that that's an or. So it could be either this or this, and you get this. So you don't have to have both of them to get V. Okay, syllogism, I don't know. If X, then Y. You already know that. If Y, then X. This is just the like, if X, then Y, if Y, then X. So if X, then Z. You get that, I'm sure. Translating if-then statements into contrapositives. I think you know how to do contrapositives. Must reverse, yeah, so you just reverse and negate the terms to form the contrapositive. Change any ands to ors and any ors to ands. Neither nor equals not x and not y. That's good to know. I didn't know that. Neither nor. So if x, then neither y nor z. So that's if x, then not y and not z. So this is just, this isn't the example I was just saying out. I was just pulling the last thing out of my head. But neither nor is not blank and not blank. Okay. Yep, I already talked about this. Unless and without is the same as then. You negate the sufficient term and then put the then, the arrow. The word but, rhetorically different from and, actually functions the same as and in formal logic translations. So but in a formal logic statement is the same as and. That's good to know. Let's see. Making valid deductions from conditional statements containing an exclusive or provision. An exclusive or. An or statement is not mutually exclusive unless stated explicitly. If x, then y or z. If x, then y or z. Not mutually exclusive, meaning if x, you can have y, z, or both. If it's explicitly stated that you can have both, it'll tell you, and you should note it, but not both mutually. I don't know, I kind of still have trouble with that, so if you have any thoughts on mutual exclusivity, shoot it my way. Okay. If soup, then salad or dessert, flipping it around, you say not for both and change that to an and. If not salad and not dessert, then not soup. If soup, then